Hey guys and girls, welcome to episode 13 of the Elite Strength Podcast. Here with Coach Nic Weir, based in Queensland, and we're going to have a good chat about some genetics, epigenetics, and then the fun stuff in PEDs. Please also remember, we are not doctors, and it's purely hypothetical and just basically talking shit. Hopefully you enjoy.
Nutrition, lifestyle, and PED education. This is the Elite Strength Podcast with Aaron Scarfy.
Hey guys and girls, welcome to episode 13 now of the Elite Strength Podcast with Mr. Nic Weir. How are you, good sir?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks, man. I really appreciate you having me on, Really do.
Man, I was looking forward to having you on and having a good chat about some genetics and epigenetics and probably deep dive a little bit into PEDs. I feel like we both have a passion for it. But before we do, I shall preface this only podcast I've ever done to actually preface it. We are not doctors. So everything that we do say is actually just banter and chat. Don't do drugs. And if you are, go speak to your doctor first so that they're liable for everything and not us. But yeah, man. So how you been? How you been? How's Queensland, considering Melbourne is still in lockdown?
Oh, man. Yeah, I don't know how you guys are doing it, Like, I take my hat off to you. I couldn't be dealing with that right now. Like, I'd do my head in. Obviously, like, we yeah, I mean, like, we've both touched on this in the past. Like, you and I are both introverts, so not much has really changed in the way of our lives when we do go into that kind of lockdown. But it's a case of not having the choice to be able to go to the gym and that sort of thing. Just the choice being taken away is what messes with us. But yeah, no, good up here. Just shitty weather this week. They've predicted it to be pretty bad the entire week, I think. So I'm just kind of like getting used to it. It was a bit rainy this morning, and obviously, no one can drive in the rain. So it put me back.
When you say bad weather, you mean just a bit of rain. It's still hot and humid, right? Or like warm and humid at least.
Yeah, warm and humid. Not quite hot yet, but it'll definitely get hot. I mean, anybody who's familiar with Queensland weather will know that summers are pretty notoriously hot. It's definitely not comfortable. And you're a cold weather person, or?
Nah, man, I prefer the heat.
Oh no.
Yeah, I love the heat. Hot, stinky, sweaty, sticky. Give it to me. Like, I prefer it. I love the heat. I hate the cold weather. I'm the exact opposite. I feel like this is when we'll touch on genetics, but it's funny. Like, my genetics, I'm half Italian, half Aboriginal. So I feel like my Aboriginal genes just come through when it comes to the heat. I'm just like, yes, it's like 35 degrees. And I'm like, it's not that hot. Relax.
Yeah. It definitely does. Yeah, it definitely does play a role. The small epigenetical changes in like generations over time in certain locales around the world. Yeah. It's interesting stuff, but I can't stand hot weather, so we should probably trade places. I should go down to Melbourne. Done. Once you're out of lockdown, of course.
Yeah, I was going to say, you don't want to be coming down anytime soon by the look of it, man. It's crazy times going on. But topic at hand, genetics and epigenetics, I guess, something that's, I guess, sometimes spoken about in a very brief and generalized terms, and their effects on the ability to build muscle. But I guess let's have a little bit more of a deep dive. So I know your specialty and your favorite topic is genetics, and you're, at uni studying biomedicine from memory?
Yeah, biomedicine. Yeah. So major in biotech, which is pretty much the Australian equivalent of genetics. And then I'm doing a minor in psychology and a minor in I haven't decided on my second minor yet, but I'm leaning toward nutrition, even though I already have a couple accreditations in nutrition. It's always good to add to the repertoire. So
yeah, for sure, man. What, I guess, before we get into it, drew you to genetics? What made you want to learn about genetics specifically?
Funnily enough, it actually stems all the way back to my childhood. So my mother, my parents, they divorced when I was 5, but around the time of my parents divorcing, my mother said she wanted to go back to university, and she ended up going back to start studying genetic engineering. And I used to read the textbooks that she had as a kid, and I was just fascinated, like absolutely fascinated. And it really sparked a keen interest in science and biology and all the other sciences, to be honest, to do with like the human body and just living organisms and not so much like chemistry. I mean, chemistry is cool, but I definitely like specific types of chemistry more than others, like organic and bio. Not a big fan of like hard chemistry, but that's just because it doesn't really have as much to relevance to obviously what we're interested in. But yeah, no, it stemmed there. She obviously had to discontinue it, just being working full time as a chef and being a full time mother, that sort of thing. Yep. It was difficult to juggle, but yeah, no, it sparked an interest. And then initially I went to university straight out of high school, but even though I knew kind of the direction of the area I kind of wanted to study, I wasn't very clear on the why. There weren't a lot of intrinsics developed, so it was really hard for me to kind of stay driven to want to keep doing it. So I started with just a basic like science degree when I first went, which wasn't biomed or anything. It was just like Bachelor of Science. And,
Sweet.
Yeah, wasn't very human specific or like animal specific. There was a lot of plant science.
Plants,
and that really
it's so boring.
It just killed my interest. Like, I mean, photosynthesis. I couldn't tell you how many times I left a lecture the moment they mentioned photosynthesis. I'm just not a fan of plant biology, and it's just me personally. But so yeah, I did 2 years of that degree, then I pulled out before the last year. Which is stupid. I probably should have just finished it so I had one degree under my belt. But, you know, you do stupid shit when you're young. So, yeah, I left and then obviously pursued coaching and then returned to study now, yeah.
Yeah, nice. I guess when you look at your coaching background and your, I guess, training history, so started in powerlifting, is that right?
Yeah,
or did you sort of start as a bro like the rest of us and then move to powerlifting?
Well, yeah, I suppose if you want to get technical, I did kind of start as a bro. The bro, that first year.
Always.
Yeah. Wearing the Gold Gym stringers in a Jets Fitness, which was like the only 24-hour gym that was, I suppose, in Australia at the time that I started training in a gym. You probably remember that too. Like, there weren't many franchises in Australia in like the late 2000s. Like, yeah. So I joined a Jets and this whole stringer scene for like a good 6 to 12 months. Then I remember walking into an Anytime Fitness once and I just saw this big New Zealander who was just like squatting, I think it was 220 kilo, like bare knees, no sleeves, no wraps for like sets of 6 or something. And I was just blown away. I'd never seen that's just unheard of and unseen back then. Like to see somebody in a commercial gym lift that much weight, let alone in a strength gym. And I remembered approaching him after. I said, "Oh man, like that's a pretty impressive squat." And he said, "Oh, thanks. I'm coming back from a injury, just three months into my rehab." And I'm like, "You're kidding me?" He said, "No." I said, "What do you normally squat?" And he said, "Oh, my best squat's 305 in comp in sleeves." And I was like, "Wow." And I was interested. Yeah. Then I obviously pursued powerlifting.
And how long had you done powerlifting for?
Quite a while.
Yeah, I think it's been a while.
Yeah. I mean, I'll be honest. I was a lazy powerlifter. Like, I'm not going to try make it sound any better than that. I would skip my accessories. I was that guy for the first 3 years of like powerlifting training. I trained powerlifting powerlifting focus for a total of about, I want to say 5 years. The first few years, I would skip pretty much every accessory and I would literally do like a 1 RM every session, whether it was squat, bench or deadlift. It was work up to a 1 RM for the day, maybe do like a back off triple or a back off double. And then I might do leg extensions if I'm not feeling like a complete piece of shit. Like, yeah,
that's fair. Well, I mean, it's not like you were a shit powerlifter. You did get invited to pro or once, twice?
Yeah, and I don't think I would have. I don't think I would have reached that if it weren't for the help of my coach at the time, Will. Like, I mean, I ended up. I think all of us are the same. You're probably the same in that you didn't hire or pursue a coach in the first few years of lifting. You kind of you're in that mentality. I think everybody gets into that mentality when they initially start training or taking the training more seriously. Of I know enough, or I can learn whatever I need to learn from the internet, and you kind of do that, and you don't realize the true value in a coach until later on. And so once I got that, swallowed my pride. I developed a lot more strength. He was the one that really got me out of the habit of skipping my accessories. And then I was like, oh, go figure. You get stronger when you actually like do all of your training.
Who would have thought? Well, I mean, what did you compete under? It wasn't under 110s. It was at 95, right? Or am I going crazy?
No. Under 110s, yeah.
I was under 110s. Yeah. What numbers did you put up?
They were pretty. I mean, they were pretty decent, but they would have been a lot better had I started seeing my EP before I went to
Of
Pro
course,
Roll. Yeah. I think best squat was 290 or 295. Best bench was 190, and best deadlift was 330. Deadlift was always a strong. Yeah,
you did put up some really big numbers. I remember I was there at that Pro Roll. I remember watching. So, I was handling. Yeah, I was handling.
That's right. I remember you now. Yeah, I actually remember you. Yeah, I saw you at the back. Yeah.
I was handling at the back, so running around, making sure everyone was getting their shit done. Good times. But I mean, they're not really small numbers. Let's say, would you think that your, I guess, background in maybe your genetics or even your epigenetics played a part in your ability to lift, I guess, those sort of numbers at that weight class? Because they're pretty decent numbers. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I don't want to say to people like I have shit genetics or anything. I don't think I have shit genetics. I don't think I have like cream of the crop genetics either. I think I've got a relatively good response to training, and I do accredit that a lot to, like my epigenetics. And I think a lot of that I owe thanks to my parents, because both my parents, the years leading up to deciding that they wanted to have kids, and then throughout the period that my mother was pregnant, my parents lifted weights 5-6 days a week, did cardiovascular training regularly. My dad stopped smoking while like the year leading up to obviously like trying for a child or whatever. And so they were very kind of like conscious of their actions and their impact on us children, which was really good, my sister and I. So I think we definitely got a little bit lucky in that sense. My sister builds muscle very well for a female, and she was always that chick with the relatively like good V-taper when we did swimming as kids and that sort of thing. And myself, like I've found that I can lose body fat pretty easily. I can build muscle pretty easily, but I can also gain body fat quite easily if I really push calories up, which isn't that uncommon. Most people struggle with that, but yeah, no, I definitely think that helped, and I think it's probably what allowed me to get to where I got to without taking everything 100% seriously. Whereas now, since I've started bodybuilding in probably what's like just under the last year, I've really crossed my T's and dotted my I's and just gotten my act together, because I realized that I'm very passionate about bodybuilding. Even though I loved powerlifting, I was never anywhere near as passionate as this. I realized and acknowledged that in order to get the maximum potential out, I need to put in everything that I can. And so, I finally sorted my nutrition, finally started seeing an EP last year, and that did wonders, especially for my chest growth, because I was always plagued with shoulder issues. Every prep for powerlifting, I'd get shoulder issues about 6 weeks out, and then it'd just butcher my bench, and then somehow I'd always like just half-ass pull something out of the deck, like on comp day,
Yeah, for sure, man. Well, I guess for the listeners, what is the difference between when we talk about genetics versus epigenetics? Just a basic rundown of each.
So like epigenetics is like the changes in organisms caused by like a modification of like gene expression. So it's like it's not like a complete change in your genome, but it's like slight variants or like subtle changes that will allow you to essentially like have a slightly different outcome from some sort of like stress or some sort of environmental factor. So an example would be like if you live like a very shitty lifestyle, and this is like really simplifying it, and you decide to have children, if your body composition's subpar to where it was when you were, say, in your 20s or early 30s, and if your diet's terrible diet model, like your sleep hygiene's poor, that sort of thing, and you decide to conceive and have children then, and if you're doing recreational drugs, which I really hope you're not when you're conceiving children, it can have a deleterious impact on how that child turns out, and you can really give your child a short straw. Like they can really draw a short straw genetically because of those negative epigenetical changes that might occur as a result of those poor lifestyle choices and decisions. But it's not just like lifestyle factors can affect it, like environmental factors can also affect it to a degree. Like, but yeah, hence like we were talking about, like your heritage being Aboriginal and Italian, like it can influence certain things in us. Like, I mean, I tolerate the cold very well, which is, I suppose it makes sense because all my heritage is German and Scottish, so very cold climates, very cold areas, and I typically tan pretty well too, which is pretty typical of Germans. And so, there's a lot of subtle things that you can inherit from just things passed down through generations. And it's why the royal family looks so retarded, because they're actually incest. A lot of bad. Like, not to hate on anybody who's English. Like, if you're not related to the royal family, you're probably fine, so don't stress. But if you're related to the royal family, I've got some bad news for you. You've got some serious like inbreeding in your heritage.
That's, which is even more funny, because I do have actually a couple of people in England that listen to this, so this should be fun for them. So when we're looking at epigenetics, what can influence? So we talk about environmental factors. Is epigenetics also influenced by things like, let's say for hypertrophy? For yourself, even, is probably a good example. You said you were a swimmer when you were younger. So would that ability and being, active as a child have an influence on you later in your, young adult to adult life, being able to then accrue muscle and that sort of thing?
Yeah. I think it definitely has an influence. But like the thing with epigenetical changes is they're technically reverse. Oh, that's a good way to actually differentiate between the two. So like epigenetical changes are technically reversible. But they don't change. And then you in terms of like, they don't change your actual like DNA sequence, but they will change how you essentially respond to certain things. Whereas your genetics is referring to your actual DNA sequence and like your, so that's probably like the best way to explain the difference between them. I think it definitely has an impact. It has an influence. You see it a lot with certain individuals. Like, I've always had sort of flat feet, but they definitely got more flat from the years and years of swimming that I did. And I think that was just a subtle epigenetical change. And you also see it occur over generations in certain areas and certain populations around the world. There's I won't be able to remember the name of the actual village, but there's a village in Asia where the inhabitants have swam like notoriously for generations and spent a lot of time underwater, and they've actually developed underwater eyesight that's very comparable to some sea creatures. Like, they can see crystal clear underwater, and normal people obviously can't do that. But that's a trait that they've inherited over the years, and they've also inherited a longer or a greater lung capacity, I should say. They're able to stay underwater for longer periods of time. Like, I think on average, everybody in the village can stay underwater while swimming around for about 8 to 9 minutes, which is phenomenal. Compared to over here, people will struggle to stay underwater for 2 minutes. You can obviously train that ability over time, and I guess you could even say there's a bit of an epigenetical change there if you train that ability. But it's just those repetitive changes in behavior and lifestyles over generations will lead to more long-term changes to the genome. But the epigenetical changes are kind of what occur in each generation.
Yeah, cool. And so that would that have an influence, I guess, epigenetics on the ability to grow muscle? So it's like, what sort of things, when people say that they have like shit genetics or good genetics, and we're looking at, you look at them and you sort of look at, their muscle bellies, for example, and like, they've got good sized muscle bellies, and you're like, well, like, what world do you think you have bad genetics? So it's like, what is it that a person, or I guess, what is it that we're looking at when someone says they have bad genetics for muscle building? That is, we'll keep it specific to hypertrophy.
All right, so we've obviously got certain genes that influence various things in the body, and in the case of growth, there are specific genes that heavily influence muscle growth in the body and those sort of things. And I mean, everybody's very familiar with probably myostatin and mTOR. They're two terms that people are probably quite familiar with. You can have different polymorphisms, which are essentially like different forms of the same gene, if that makes sense. So when we say polymorphism, we're referring to like a form or a morphism of that gene, a type of that same gene. So there could be like a number of different polymorphisms for the myostatin gene, and then if you have a more favorable one for growth, then you're going to have a better response to training stimulus and that sort of thing, and it's going to have an impact and influence on how you respond. And so that's kind of like what people mean when they say good genetics, I think. That, and also anthropometrics, like if you have very good proportions for bodybuilding, that would be considered good genetics, like maybe not having overly long femurs relative to like your tibia and that sort of thing. So you've got kind of like all those, I guess, other areas to consider, but a lot of the time, when people say good genetics or bad genetics, it's obviously situational to what they're actually talking about. Powerlifting, good genetics is not the same as good genetics for bodybuilding, although there's some overlap. It's very, like, I mean, for a classic bodybuilder, you could probably argue that the genetics or like the ideal genetic lottery wouldn't be ideal for powerlifting, because powerlifting, you want big, robust, large joints that can handle a lot of stress. You want preferably probably longer muscle attachments and things like that. Whereas bodybuilding, especially with certain parts of the body, you might want shorter muscle attachments. You might want smaller joints, things like that, to accentuate or what's the correct word? To enhance the overall look or the muscularity of the physique. Because if you have big joints, it's obviously going to detract from how big you appear visually at a certain weight.
Sure.
And things like that. So that in conjunction with how easily an individual loses body fat, which you could tie into and look at like thyroid function, estradiol production, things like that. Because obviously you mentioned a while ago that like estrogen's a mild lipolytic acting compound or hormone in the body, I guess you would say, depending if you're taking it exogenously or you're talking about the endogenous production.
That's exactly,
so it's multifaceted, but that's what people mean when they say good genetics, I think. Like, you build muscle easily, you lose fat relatively well, you can push calories quite high and stay injury free, you look big, or you're very robust.
Is there a way for us to, I guess, assess our own genetics when it comes to, let's again use the example of muscle building? Is there a way for us to be like, maybe I do have good genetics or decent genetics to grow, or maybe I'm like, I think I hit I didn't hit the jackpot on this one, and I'm not going to be able to build muscle as much or as well. Is there anything that we can look for or anything we can do to sort of assess that, as an individual?
There kind of is. I mean, there's a combination of like actual genetic testing that you can do. I mean, I kind of question the validity of some genetic testing. I think it definitely has like practical application and efficacy, but it's definitely kind of new charted territory for us in terms of like commercially available gene testing, that sort of thing. It hasn't been around for a very, very long time. But you could get your genomes tested and find out what kind of polymorphisms of certain genes you have, and that could give you an indicator as to how you're going to respond and that sort of thing. And you could see what kind of IGF-1 receptors you have, that sort of thing. Or you could just literally document your progress and compare it to what is the mean or the average for an individual training for that given period of time with that level of experience, that sort of thing. So you can compare your results to other people's and get a better idea as to whether or not you're progressing well or not. But I always say to people, like, just because you progress well naturally doesn't necessarily mean you're going to progress well enhanced, and vice versa. I mean, there's some individuals that respond very well to training and nutrition, but then you throw drugs into the mix and they might get like a mild benefit and a mild improvement in the rate of growth and the rate of fat loss. But then you get an individual who has a pretty average response to training and nutrition naturally, and then you give them the smallest amount of drugs and they just turn into Nic Walker. Like there is some inconsistencies there. Yeah.
Yeah, of course, those, I guess, lie outside the bell curve, right?
Yeah, big time, yeah.
So I guess when we are looking at the ability to grow muscle, when it comes to, I guess, epigenetics, is there anything that we can do to influence our ability to grow muscle, like short of, taking PEDs, which we'll get into in a second?
Yeah. Oh, I mean,
put it this way: like if I'm a parent, for example, and I want to give my child the best chance, and wanting to grow muscle when they get older. Like I want them to get on the Olympia stage, for example. As kids, is there anything that we can do, like as parents, to help? Not that I am a parent, but as a parent, to help influence their epigenetics, I guess, because you can't really influence their genetics, influencing their epigenetics to help give them a leg up, so to speak, as they get older.
Yeah, there's definitely stuff you can do. I mean, I guess tying back into, not to make the center, like me, the center of the conversation, but tying back into my childhood, my parents, they lived very, what you could say, quote unquote, healthy lifestyles when they were trying to have kids. And I think that's one thing that you can definitely do to improve the chances of your child or your offspring having a good starting point when it comes to being a good athlete. You'll find that most of the best athletes in the world either had quite active parents, like as a general kind of rule, like or parents that were athletes themselves. And I mean, there's something to say for that there. And then on top of that too, it sounds like a bit of a eugenics topic, but being selective with who you actually procreate with, having more thought into the vain things that people don't want to think about out of fear of being, I guess, vilified and that sort of thing. Like, well, if you want your child to be a good athlete, you probably shouldn't conceive children with somebody who's very, very susceptible to developing several types of cancer and has terrible anthropometrics, doesn't have a lot of lean body mass. Even though they're a lovely person, keep in mind, like, there's nothing wrong at all with having children with anybody that you want to have children with, of course, but you've just got to understand that there's a potential repercussion that you're throwing into the deck there of giving your child somewhat of a potential disadvantage. There's no way to know, obviously, and like anything, there's always statistical outliers. Like everybody could probably think of an overweight couple that have a couple of children who are ridiculously lean. Like it does happen. There's statistical outliers, but typically children will inherit like the epigenetic changes that their parents pass down to them, and then also the various lifestyle habits that their parents practice when the child is young.
So basically, you've heard it here first. If you want to have genetically elite babies, find a genetically elite partner and just get them pregnant, or the other way around. If you're the female, just find them, get yourself pregnant. Like, that's it.
Yeah. I hate that question because it makes me sound like an arsehole when I answer that.
There's nothing wrong with an honest conversation. It's not like we're telling everybody to go do that. If you end up falling in love and you want to have a kid with them, like, go nuts. It's just, I guess, how can we potentially, if there are ways to influence, I guess, a kid's epigenetics to see if they can, become what they want to become. So basically, everyone just needs to marry Chris Bumstead. That's it.
Well, that's the thing.
But no, that's fair enough, man. I guess one other question before we dive into, I guess, a bit of PED stuff, but when you say in terms of procreation, if, for example, the parents, let's say they were, overweight and all that sort of stuff prior to conceiving, and then, went through, let's call it a 12-week transformation, for example.
Yeah.
Both parents go through a 12-week transformation, both get really lean, we're talking like optimal health, I guess is probably the best way to put it. Good lean mass, relatively low body fat for both male and female, and then they decide to conceive. How does that, would that influence, I guess, the baby being born, and like, would that give them, a leg up, or would it be that they need to be that sort of way, like in terms of the parents having to be like lean and healthy and all that sort of stuff for a longer period of time?
Definitely
conceiving, that is.
I think the longer the better. It's hard to give like an exact value on it. I could only just make the arbitrary recommendation of like, the longer that you can live a healthy lifestyle prior to having children, the better, and the higher the chance that you're gonna pass that to your children, because like anything, things take time to change, and so I mean, the ideal scenario would be you've lived a healthy lifestyle, say like 1 to 2 decades leading up to when you wanted to have children, or at least a decade. I mean, anything that you do is obviously going to help your chances, but the longer, the more likely it's actually going to. Yeah,
fair enough. PEDs, how do they, or I guess, would they influence these things, kids' epigenetics and that sort of stuff?
See, that's a tricky one. I mean, I guess because we don't have a lot of literature on super physiologic dosages of androgens and various other compounds that competitive athletes take, and purely because obviously ethically it's not really sound. So it's hard to like give a conclusive answer, but I definitely personally think it does have an influence, because I mean, the way anabolics work is they do change your gene expression, and they do increase protein synthesis, things like that. It'll increase myonuclear donation within the body, causing you to obviously have a higher nucleus cell count per muscle cell, and a lot of other small changes that kind of occur over time with prolonged use. So I think if someone used anabolics their entire life and they somehow got their HPG axis working very well, and then conceived children, or if they were just a statistical outlier like Ronnie Coleman and just like had 7 children while he was prepping for Mr. Olympia, I definitely think it'll have an effect. Whether it has a positive or a negative effect, I think both are potentially possible. Like, I mean, it could completely ruin your child's health, or it could potentially really improve their chances of being a very high level athlete. Like, it's hard to say, but I think it definitely has an impact. That's for sure.
Yeah. I guess hypothetically speaking, what potential sides or potential negatives do you think would occur? We know the positives, basically you become a superhuman, but the other side to that, I guess, what would you be thinking, I guess, if you were to think that thought through?
I'd say a higher likelihood of developing any genetic defects that you might be carrying heterozygous genes for. So, I mean, if you and your partner are carrying like a gene for the same kind of genetic disorder, I think if your body's gone through, I guess, more stress throughout life via exogenous hormone usage or abusage, I think there's probably a higher likelihood that you're going to predispose your child to developing whatever genetic faults you have. It's hard to say beyond that. It's definitely not something that I've looked into a lot, so I definitely don't feel comfortable talking a lot about it, but that's my hypothesis though. Yeah,
that's fair. Like I said, it's just more an open thought. I guess it's something that's never considered, right? So
what are your thoughts on it?
Man, honestly, I like you sort of said in that my minor was in biology, but it's like looking at it, and when you start to look at potential genetic defects, I do think it would just exacerbate it, because it also does the opposite as if we're going to look at the positives. So it exacerbates, protein synthesis and all of these, positive effects on, let's say, muscle growth and the ability to generate power and, all this sort of stuff. So, there's always a yin and a yang, right? So the other side to that would have to be that it, it could also exacerbate the negatives. It's kind of like growth hormone. When we look at growth hormone, people, always wanting to take growth hormone, and they're like, oh yeah, like this is great because it does this and this. And it's like, yeah, but if you also have these other problems like, tumors and whatnot, growth hormone is probably not a good thing to use because it exacerbates everything.
Exactly. Yeah. It does exactly what the name implies. It causes growth like systemically. Yeah. And a lot of people they overlook that. And I know a lot of people, I mean, you probably know a lot of people too that either developed, cancer from that like exact thing, usage of growth hormone, or destroyed their kidneys. Because a lot of people don't understand, like, especially when you take it higher than a therapeutic dose, if you could call it that, it does have a very, very negative effect on the kidneys over time.
Yeah, well, it's got a negative effect on a lot of things, right? When it starts to grow, things like your intestines and whatnot. I mean, you wonder why people's stomach and stuff starts growing and stuff. And that's when we saw for a period of time on stage on, high level bodybuilding comps, people are having what they used to keep calling HGH gut now, whether it was that or whether it was, their stomach's actually full of food due to insulin use and all that sort of stuff. We don't know, but we do know that it causes growth. And I think even Rich Piana, before he passed, had I think his belly button had split open from memory because of growth use. But again, he was a little bit crazy when it came to growth use. I don't know if you ever listened to his protocol, but it was pretty fucking interesting, I'll tell you that much.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine it'd be anything pretty. What did he run?
Just for reference. So I remember this was in one of his YouTube videos years ago, and it stuck with my mind. It stuck in my head only because of how absurd and crazy it was. For an entire year, he ran 16 IU a day.
Whoa.
Yeah, I was just like, man.
That's asking for problems. That is asking for problems.
Well, I mean, he also did pass away young-ish, so kind of makes, I guess, a bit of sense. But he was always of that mindset, right? Like, I'm just going to get as big as I can, and if I die, I die, which is, I guess, what happened.
And then Boston Lloyd, I mean, he seems like a nice guy, but he just very irresponsible with his usage. I mean, I think he's on dialysis now, where he's waiting to, he's just destroyed his kidneys. And I mean, he's only young. I think he's in his late 20s or something. Like, it's pretty tragic.
And that's the thing with a lot of this stuff. And I think a lot of the PED usage there will move away from the sort of the genetics and epigenetics, and let's move into the fun stuff. Let's talk about drugs. No, looking at like PED usage and stuff, and now employing this model of a more safer style use, right? Because when we start to look at like the actual research, and we look at the dosages used in research, and they always use more to basically almost test and see where the side effects pop in, because that's what a lot of them have been doing over the years in terms of the research. So then we know what the effective dosage is, or basically what the dosage is that you need to see a bit of a result, not to go overboard. So we start looking at things like, testosterone use, and, the actual research states or shows that you don't really need to go over 600 milligrams in total per week. So it's like, and you hear people doing 1 gram and you're like, well, why? Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. It's like, like you mentioned, there's a point of diminishing returns, and it's like, you might accumulate, say, an additional 10% growth for going from that 600 to 1 gram, but you might accumulate a 40% higher likelihood of developing side effects. So it's like, is that trade-off really worth it? Like, and then the financial trade-off too, like you're spending nearly double as much money on it. It's like, I really don't think it's worth it. Like, and you'd wholeheartedly agree, I reckon.
Yeah, and we start to look at things that I guess that's like, it's starting to turn a little bit, and people are starting to change their minds on a lot of things. Or hopefully anyway, with better information and things, like people still raving about like Trenbolone being, the best thing to use, because, you get jacked and you get lean, and it's kind of like, but
it's also extremely neurotoxic. I mean, extremely neurotoxic, causes buildup of plaque on the beta amyloid receptors, I believe.
Yeah, it's exactly what it does. Yeah.
And same thing with Nandrolone to a milder extent. But I mean, it makes sense. They're both derivatives of the same base hormone, Nandrolone and Tren. But Trenbolones are terrible. Out of all of the anabolics you could use, it's probably one of the most dangerous ones, at least talking injectables. Yeah, well, I mean, you did a bit of work on Trenbolone from memory, right? Having a look at it and a bit more deep diving. Yeah, I did. I did a video a while ago. It wasn't very extensive. I should have cited more literature, but obviously the literature we have access to is quite limited, and it's on cattle and things like that. But I mean, you have bros in the gym that are running 400 milligrams of tren a week minimum a lot of the time, and they don't understand that they're giving 80 to 100 milligrams a week to cattle, like full-grown cows that are 2-3 times a human's body weight, and these cattle were packing on slabs of muscle. It's like you do not need the dosages that people were using of this compound to see the growth that they wanted, and it's a very, very potent compound. I mean, even if you have a mild response to androgens in general, like if you take Trenbolone, I think you're going to have a substantially greater response than any other compound. But obviously, with that comes a greater extent of side effects. And
I feel like a lot of people, because it is a 19-door testosterone, that people think that it's not androgenic. And it's just kind of like, because like, there's this, I guess, bro type thought process where it's like, oh, the 19 nors aren't androgenic because they're water-based and they're 19 nors. And it's kind of like, it's not how it works.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. But that's the problem though. Like a lot of people make these false assumptions and then they go run stuff and they wonder why they get X, Y, or Z side effect months down the track. It's like, well, if you actually did your reading a little bit more, you'd realize that your assumption was completely invalid and you've literally just subjected your body to a bunch of stress that you didn't want to subject it to, and you like your progesterone panel is probably going to be out of whack, that sort of thing. And that's something that you have to consider too, because there's a lot of downstream effects of that. And I mean, being a male too, it's definitely something you want to be wary of.
Yeah, right, because progesterone is kind of important. So wanting to making sure that they stay within its natural range or its normal range, I guess would be the better word, is more ideal.
Yeah. Big time, yeah. Because a lot of people might think about like the direct effects that these hormones have in terms of like the hormones within the body, but they don't think about the downstream cascading effects from that. Like, I mean, that's something that you'd probably look at a lot more too. It's like when you do reading on various compounds, it's like, it's not so much the effect that tren might have on, say, your like, or the lack of effect it has on, say, something like estrogen or something like that, but more so the downstream effects, and more so the neurological effects, because they're probably the most detrimental side effects of 19 NORs. I mean, they're existent with all compounds at super physiologic dosages, but testosterone, when taken at physiologic dosages, is actually neuroprotective, and a lot of that has to do, obviously, with the estradiol production, estradiol conversion from or aromatization from that testosterone that's been administered or produced in the body. But even then, like estradiol, if that drops below the normal range, or any kind of like estrogen for that matter, while your testosterone's in the normal range, you're going to experience some neurotoxicity too. It's all the body has these ranges, or it produces this amount of X, Y, or Z hormone for a reason. And when you start messing with the ratios of everything, that's where you start running into the problems.
Yeah, and it's why we like to try and use when we're building or looking at compound stacks and that sort of thing, and we start to hear these things where people do like, tren only, NPP only, masteron only, like without a test base. And it's like, well, you don't understand that you're not using, it's one, you're getting the benefits of using testosterone, let's be real, but it's also you're getting the benefits of its side effect, which is the aromatization of estrogen. So it's like you need estrogen, like as much as you may not like the idea of it, like unless you're exhibiting side effects, like there's nothing wrong with having a higher estrogen count, because the idea is that it's there for a reason.
Exactly, yeah. And I mean, if you could even make an argument, if your testosterone is at a super physiologic level, like above the natural range, then you probably want your estrogen to be above the range too, respectively, like maintaining that same ratio. It's kind of the whole argument of like LDL, HDL cholesterol, that the ratio is more important than the actual values themselves. I think there's a bit of truth in that too when it comes to like sex hormones in the body, but obviously having super physiologic levels of any hormones for extended periods of time is going to be detrimental to health.
Of course,
But minimizing the risk associated with that while on a cycle, things like that, probably be argued that, yeah, it is beneficial to have slightly higher estradiol, provided that you obviously, like you said, not experiencing any negative effects from that, like excessive sensitivity in the breast tissue, like gynecomastia development, that sort of thing, and excessive water retention, which could put a lot of unnecessary additional stress on the kidneys, for example, and the heart. So like things like that. But obviously you can mitigate a lot of those things. And I mean, I think we spoke about this very briefly in the past, like using the deployment of certain ancillaries to help negate some of the effects of anabolics, like the blood pressure effects and things like that. I mean, it's definitely useful to look at that route, especially if, say, you're one of those high-level competitors who is 300 pounds plus on stage, and you are running a lot of compounds because your body just can't maintain that level of tissue otherwise, and then you need to kind of like, it might be a case of like, well, the pros outweigh the cons of running an extra ancillary versus not running it. But yeah, it's always a case of weighing up the pros and the cons, and it's situational. Like you'd agree with me, hey, like there's no one size fits all. You have to assess it case by case.
Always, and that's why we also look at the other parameter of doing this stuff, and it's like making sure you get your blood test done, making sure that we are at a decent body fat level to start doing this sort of stuff, making sure that it is very goal specific, and also making sure the goal is worth the risk, which is, I think, a big thing. A lot of people going to coaches and always, wanting to, basically get bigger. And it's kind of like, well, what's your goal? And it's like, well, it's just like to get bigger. And it's kind of like, well, are you sure you want to put your health at that sort of risk for such a simple goal that will just simply take time? Like,
yeah,
you know what I mean? Like, what's bigger to you? You know what I mean? You want to put on 20 kilos of mass, or you're happy just to put on a couple of kilos every year for the next 10 years, which is still, 10 kilos over time. Like,
yeah. No, 100%.
Yeah. Always looking to push people away, I think, more so than bring to when it comes to PEDs, because it's just, I guess everyone wants everything now, right?
Yeah, we live in a very instantly gratified kind of society where, instant gratification is like rampant. Everyone expects everything now. Like, I mean, we don't have to go out to a bar to meet people anymore. We can just swipe left or right on our phone. We can get stuff express ordered to our house. We don't even have to like go to the shop anymore. We don't have to post a letter. It's just, everything we do is so instantaneous. And there's pros to that, but obviously, like a lot of cons too. Everyone wants everything now. Impatience has like skyrocketed since the technology. What is it? The technology revolution has like boomed. Yeah, that's what I was trying to.
Yeah. But that's what I sort of say to people. And it's like when we're looking at things like estrogen, I guess when we start playing with DHTs, right? So when we start looking at things like Masteron, for example, or Trenbolone, like. Much more popular, I think, nowadays for growth and wanting to be, since they are a bit more tissue selective, not as tissue selective as obviously something like a Trenbolone, but I think people don't really understand that Trenbolone is not as overly tissue selective at higher dosages. Whereas, it's only tissue selective at a really low dose, and then once it gets to like, I think it was 200 or 300 milligrams plus, it's kind of like, it doesn't care.
It will cause growth. Anyway.
Anywhere and everywhere, really. But with things like testosterone, things with Masteron and Trenbolone, we know that it also has this nice little effect of counteracting and balancing estrogen. Not that it acts as an AI, because it's not how it works. It just, reacts a little differently on the androgen and estrogen receptors. When we look at using a DHT and we start to see the estrogen drop a little bit lower than, I guess, what it would normally be if we didn't have that DHT. And what is it that you think we could be doing to potentially, I guess, keep estrogen high, or do you reckon we should be worried about that sort of thing, or just sort of let it do its thing until we come off?
It's hard to say. Like, it'd come down to whether or not, say this was like the person, I guess, trying to assess whether or not they should deploy something to manage it. Like, assess how you feel. Like, it's why it's really important. It sounds real cheesy, but keep a journal when you're on a cycle. Like, keep a journal, like a logbook of how you feel each day. Like, monitor things like libido, mood, like how depressed or how happy you are, that sort of thing. And if you're starting to notice a big decline in your general well-being, then it's probably a good idea to look at managing that number and bringing that value down, or bringing it up, depending on whether it's above or below the range. I definitely think it's too hard to make kind of like a general kind of like one size fits all statement. But yeah, I mean, I know some individuals who they can have their like estradiol well above the range, like people I've spoken to in England, and they feel fine. And then other people I know of, like the moment it gets to a high end of the normal range, they start experiencing sensitive nipples, things like that. Yep. So it's very individualized. But I mean, general rule of thumb is if you're in the range somewhere, like you're usually pretty good. And yeah, some people can tolerate lower levels, others higher levels without any issues. And again, it comes back to the whole, like, if you graph like a sample population, you're always going to get that bell curve of like the majority of people are going to be fine in the middle, and then there's going to be people at either end of the range. Yeah.
I guess a question when we're talking about neurotoxicity, and having obviously estrogen as it's neuroprotective. Now, when we increase like androgen load, and let's say our testosterone, free testosterone is a lot higher considering we're on super physiological doses. If the estrogen doesn't rise because we're using, let's say, a DHT to keep, well, just as it's as our main growth promoter, and that obviously keeps estrogen at bay. If estrogen's still in the normal levels, even though the ratio is now skewed because free test and testosterone is high, are we still getting the effects of the estrogen in terms of protecting, or do you think we need to increase estrogen and get it, above super physiological doses because of testosterone being through the roof effectively?
I think most individuals would feel better with a slightly higher level of estrogen. Yeah. But again, it'd come down to the individual to a degree. But I think, generally most people would feel better. And I mean, it's potentially possible that having that estrogen in the, like, say, the normal range, or in the very middle of the normal range, for example, when testosterone is well above the normal range, that discrepancy between the homeostatic ratios of those two compounds could be hampering growth. Like, it could very much so be hampering growth, and also fat loss too if they're in a deficit. I mean, if you have low estrogen when you're dieting, I mean, it's definitely not ideal for fat loss, that's for sure. But a lot of people crash their estrogen because they think, I need to get dry. They'll take an aromatase inhibitor or some other sort of, and then they wonder why they feel like crap, why their joints feel like shit. It's like, well, the body is like over 70% water. So if you're going to take a compound that's going to like really mess with your sex hormone profile and cause like water loss from the body as well, like you're going to have a bad time.
What's even more funny is when people take an AI and they don't get drier. You're like, well, I wonder why.
Well, that's it. That's exactly it. Yeah. I mean, then that could take you off into like the whole conversation of aldosterone and other water regulating hormones in the body. And I mean, I think a lot of whether or not someone loses water weight has to do with how their sex hormones are interacting with aldosterone in the body. And
the funny thing that moderates and modulates aldosterone is an angiotensin receptor blocker, like talmazepam,
exactly,
which also has a nice little effect of helping your blood pressure and a nice little
kidneys,
side effect. And also having a nice little side effect of being a slight lipolytic. So, these things that come into play, and I guess they're also part of that sort of safer use type model that a lot of people are starting to employ, where we're looking at all facets of health and also like all facets of growth, and why it probably potentially does cost a little bit more to do because you are using a lot more compounds. You're just using a lot less of these compounds and, looking at other pathways.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's another thing to talk about too and touch on. It's like the androgen receptor isn't the only means of driving growth in the body. A lot of people don't understand like the progesterone receptor and other receptors are also responsible for growth. Estrogen plays a role. And it also plays a role in the utilization of lipids for So it's really important that people consider this. And it's like your like cycle of say 1 or 2 compounds at like stupidly high dosages might seem like it's a good idea because you're using less compounds and you think, oh, I'm causing less issues. But it's like, well, no, not really. Like you're probably better off. And this isn't advice, obviously. Like this is just completely hypothetical. Like you could potentially be way better off health-wise and results-wise if you were to say have 4 or 5 different compounds at substantially lower dosages, because you're in effect driving all of these different pathways of growth. And then you're also potentially taking one of the compounds for the health effects, like you mentioned, the angiotensin receptor blocker, ARBs. And I mean, you've got different types too, like because you've obviously got angiotensin 1, angiotensin 2 receptors, that sort of thing. So yeah, like I mean, angiotensin 2 receptor blocker is probably the more common one that bodybuilders would use. And yeah, it just has to do with like where the receptors are located in the body. That has a lot to do with which angiotensin receptor blocker you'd be choosing. So it depends. Yeah, it comes back to like the purpose behind taking medication. A lot of people don't think about it that way. They just think, oh, like test is a good builder or it's a good base, so I'll take that. And then it's like DECA is good for growing because it's like it adds weight. It's like, well, no, like it doesn't work like that.
Yeah, well, it's like what we were talking about before in terms of the actual cascading effects of the downstream effects of what these things do, and we can start to actually manipulate the downstream effects by simply opening up all these other pathways and using a few more compounds or a few more little tricks of the trade, right? So it's like, we know that, just banging on the androgen receptor is only going to yield one type of result, but also we know what its side effects and potential issues it's going to bring. Instead of trying to, I guess, tackle that and, have a harder time trying to fix that issue, why not open up other pathways and have less side effects and potentially less issues, right?
Big time, 100%, yeah. It's almost like you could think of it as a way of like you're tuning your body. Like there's a bit of an art to it, or not an art. There's a bit of a science to it, I should say.
Well,
art's a bad term.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like when you're looking at when you look at a car, it's like you don't just have to put petrol in the tank for the car sort of to go. Like if it's got a flat tire, the car's not really going anywhere, so you got to pump up the tires. It's like you got to make sure the oil's good. So like these are the pathways that we're looking at when it comes to the body. It's like we're not if the petrol tank is just the androgen receptor, well, you've also got, like you said, the estrogen progesterone receptors that work not just also in anabolism and in growth, but also the protective side of things that they do. You then have things like, IGF-1, we have insulin, like we have
insulin's a big one.
Yeah. All these pathways that, really assist in growth and much more, so you can make it much more safe. Not to say that it's ever 100% safe, because that's just not how it is. But we can make it much more safe than what the old school way was, and just taking 1 and 2, compounds and beating on one receptor.
Big time, 100%, yeah. And you probably tap into some results that you otherwise wouldn't achieve having, like you said, like using just 1 or 2 compounds in high dosages. Because, let's be honest. Like, I mean, I'd have to say, out of like, even though like a lot of people use anabolics, like people heavily underestimate the potential for insulin. Yeah, so I mean, one of the biggest benefits of human growth hormone for growth is the fact that, or its impact downstream on IGF-1 production in the body. You get that same effect from insulin, pretty much, but it's more direct. And it's, I mean, you could argue that if you're using growth and not insulin, you're pretty stupid, because one, growth is 2-3 times at least more expensive than insulin, and two, you're going to get a much greater increase in IGF-1 levels, serum IGF-1 levels using insulin, especially the long-acting type Lantus, than you ever would with a similar, I guess, amount of growth cost-wise.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And it's interesting in that a lot of people just don't really think or see the benefits of using more, because at the same using more compounds, that is, a variance of compounds over various amounts of ways to grow and different pathways to grow, and metabolic pathways. Because it's funny that if you actually cross more pathways and use things for more pathways, guess what? You can actually grow for a longer period of time as well, instead of having to, just, again, beating on that androgen receptor. You might be good for 16 weeks. And that's probably where a lot of people came up with that whole this is the cycle, 12, 16 weeks, and then you need to come off, and then you need to sort of, what was it, desensitize your androgen receptors or some crap that people used to say. And then you can get back on and, do it again. And it's kind of like, well, what if you could just grow for 30 weeks?
Yeah.
What if you could just continually take things like these compounds, because your goal is to get bigger and grow for a solid 30 weeks? Like, what if?
Well, that's it. Yeah, I think a lot of those like misconceptions early on about how these hormones influenced the body is what kind of led to that flawed model approach that people had back then. I mean, the whole idea of like receptors getting blocked, like it just doesn't make sense biologically. If you do first year biology, you'll realize that just is absolute nonsense. But a lot of people don't do that. Obviously, they'll read a forum, and that's where they get the extent of their information from, or they'll listen to their favorite bodybuilder on YouTube. And I mean, although a lot of bodybuilders are becoming more and more learned these days, and there's better quality information out there, and it's more readily available, it's still definitely nowhere near the standard that it needs to be at.
Yeah, no, you're not wrong, man. So to finish up, good sir, I always ask one question, and it seems to stump everybody, bar the Paul that I had on last week. He was actually pretty quick with it. It's just about Instagram. 3 accounts you follow that better your life by the day. They're either funny, they're either motivational, training, whatever it is.
Motivational, I'd say Chris Bumstead. Informative, I'd say Luke Tulloch is good. Mm-hmm. And then quality of life, that's a difficult one. That's a difficult one.
Everyone seems to get stumped, whether it's just funny, whether it helps you relax, whether you just tune out.
Yeah.
Anything that you like.
It's I follow a biotechnology meme page, and so it's pretty good. I think it's called Biotech Mafia from memory. They just post biotech related memes. So if you have a bit of an understanding of biotech or like first year biology, you'll get a lot of the jokes, and they're pretty funny. Like they lighten my day up. If I'm having a shitty day and I see one of those in my feed, I kind of get a bit perked up and a bit happy.
No worries, man. And for the listeners, where can they find you, good sir?
Instagram handle is at Coach Nicholas Weir, CoachNicholasWeir, and my website is Universal Performance. That's www.universal-performance.com. They're the main 2 places to find me, and if you go on there, you'll be able to find anything else that I'm affiliated with. So, yeah.
Easy done, good sir. Thank you for jumping on the podcast and having a good chat.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Get you back on soon. Maybe we'll do a PED roundtable with a couple of people and have some fun.
That'll be good. Yeah, I'll do some actual preparation this time.
That's fine, man. Thanks for jumping on, dude.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
And thank you to all the listeners for tuning in. See you later.